Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so our first screencast on World War II, we're going to focus on the origins of the conflict. We're going to look at how the conflict originated in European society and then also how it originated in Asian society. So there's two different theaters in World War II. You have what's known as the European theater and the Pacific theater. The United States eventually is going to get drawn into both conflicts, although we try to remain neutral from the start in most of the interactions that we take part in. Eventually we get drawn into both the Pacific and the European theater. So today we're going to take a look at what's going on, basically the background of the European and Pacific theater, America's stance as far as neutrality, how neutral were we actually staying, and then how do we eventually get drawn into both of these conflicts. So we're going to start with the European theater and kind of the origins of the European theater. And when you look at Europe, you have to remember that Germany is the main aggressor here in World War II. So we have to focus at what kind of caused them to take these aggressive actions and try and basically conquer all of European society. So you have to trace it back to World War I. There's a strong connection between World War I and World War II. And it really goes back to the peace treaty that's signed at the end of World War I called the Treaty of Versailles. So Germany is really kind of roundly punished here in the Treaty of Versailles. They have to pay major war reparations. They have to give up all their colonies. They have to limit their military. They have to take all of their military personnel out of a region of Germany called the Rhineland. And so they are severely, severely punished as a result of World War I. And they are forced to take the war guilt and the blame for the war. And this causes a lot of resentment and animosity in German society. And so that's kind of lingering throughout the 20s and the 30s. Kind of this resentment and kind of the restrictions that are put on Germany, both financially, militarily, and kind of on their pride. So that's kind of a major background piece you want to understand. There is a lot of resentment here in Germany. Now, our fascist leaders who are going to take hold in both Germany and in Italy are going to kind of capitalize on this resentment towards the former allies during World War I. So you have Adolf Hitler who comes to power in Germany under a fascist regime in the early 1930s, and you have Benito Mussolini who comes to power in Italy a little bit earlier in the 1920s. Now both of them are fascist leaders, and what helps specifically Germany and Adolf Hitler to gain power is not only are they kind of having animosity about World War I, like the position of Germany after World War I, what happens is that because America goes into a depression in 1929 and the 1930s, our global economy is kind of linked in with a lot of the European powers, specifically Germany. Okay, and when we go into a depression, we kind of pull a lot of European society with us. So you have to think about why that is. There's a couple of major reasons. One, we've been loaning a lot of European powers, Great Britain, France during the war, and then Germany after the war, money. Through Germany specifically through a series of loans known as the Dawes Plan. So we're loaning them money, and essentially their economy is kind of tied into our economy to a certain extent. And so this allows for, after this, when their economy plummets, they're in a terrible economic situation. And, you know, Adolf Hitler comes on the scene. He's been on the political scene before, but his Nazi party then becomes popular in kind of this vacuum of, kind of a lack of responding to the depression in an adequate way for the German people. And he's eventually able to capitalize on this and take power. So I put this picture up here because I thought you guys might find it interesting. So I played this song for you guys the other day when we were talking about the Dust Bowl. The artist's name is Woody Guthrie. And so he famously used to, put this on his guitar, saying this machine kills fascists. And what he meant by that was freedom of speech, being able to speak your mind. And what we have here in the United States is able to kind of limit and stop fascism and other ideologies and overarching, authoritarian ideologies like that from taking power in a country. So fascism is on the rise in Germany. And one aspect of fascism is militarism. Is expanding your borders. So Germany and Italy are very interested in expanding their borders, showing nationalism, pride in their country. And Hitler has this grand idea that Germany is going to conquer the world, and that, you have the Aryan race that's going to repopulate and dominate the world. They very much believe in some of the ideologies we talked about in class, like scientific racism and social Darwinism, this philosophy. And to them, the Germans are a race, the Italians are a race, and they want to kind of expand and dominate, because that's what they kind of are brainwashed to believe is the right social hierarchy of the world. And so Germany's going to go on, start to break aspects of the Treaty of Versailles. We're not going to go into all the details of it, but they combine with Austria, called the Anschluss. They are going to remilitarize the Rhineland, try and take parts of Czechoslovakia that they say are ethnically German. Now, the leader of Great Britain at the time is a guy named Neville Chamberlain, and he's woefully inadequate at dealing with Hitler and his aggressive schemes here. Chamberlain's going to adopt a policy known as appeasement, which means giving in to Hitler's demands and the Germans' demands in a hopes that it's going to appease him and he's going to stop asking for things. Now, this is one of the, seen as one of the biggest foreign policy blunders in modern history. And eventually what happens is Hitler invades Poland in 1939, and that, ends the policy of appeasement totally, because it shows that Germany is going to be, a very aggressive nation. And then they go on a spree of, invading Eastern Europe, Denmark, different Northern European countries, then France. And by 1941, they've conquered a large amount of European society. Now, at this point, America is not in the conflict. We are walking again the fine line of neutrality. We kind of see the conflict brewing. So in the 1930s, the American Congress passes a series of acts known as the Neutrality Acts. Now, there's a bunch of different ones. The Neutrality Act of 1935, 1937. They keep kind of strengthening it each year. But what you want to understand here is that America and Americans want to remain neutral in this conflict. Once they see it brewing, they want to remain neutral. And then even once it starts, even though they know a lot about Hitler, they know kind of like what he stands for, he's fascist, and kind of their aggressive nature, Americans still want to remain neutral. In fact, this might be surprising to you guys, early on in World War II, before we're bombed at Pearl Harbor, 98% of Americans are against joining the conflict. Overwhelming. Okay, so this shows a mentality in American society amongst the American people, and then also amongst the American Congress, who has to act for the people and speak for the people. Americans are much more of an isolationist, have a much more of an isolationist mindset when it comes to Europe and it comes to these European conflicts in this era definitely than we have now, and even then other time periods in American history. So what you want to understand, in that 1920s through the 1930s time period into the Great Depression, that era of foreign policy is really kind of an isolationist foreign policy as far as Europe is concerned. And Americans are really kind of heeding the words of George Washington and trying to, not get in any foreign entanglements with the Europeans, because they don't want to get drawn into these conflicts. And the Europeans are making alliances with one another to try to protect each other, and Americans are trying to stay out of the conflict here. And what you also have to remember again is that America has not joined the League of Nations, which Britain and France are a part of, and some of the other Europeans are a part of. And so we have no obligation internationally to get involved in the conflict once it starts. Now, that doesn't mean that, the countries that the American government sees as natural allies aren't trying to get America to join the conflict. So when you look at this, Britain was our ally in World War I. France was our ally in World War I. They want us to join, because France already being invaded and conquered. Great Britain, they're fighting something called the Battle of Britain, where the German Lufthansa, which is their air force, is bombing Britain every night, throughout 1940, 1941. So they're struggling. They want us to get involved, but the American people are against it. So that's what you want to understand. In the 30s, the American people do not want to get involved because they don't see it as our conflict. They see it as a European conflict, and they also see that we have major economic problems at home. It's the middle of the Depression, and Americans are going to say we need to focus internally and focus on fixing the United States, not getting engaged in any kind of conflict. So they pass these neutrality acts to keep us kind of out of the conflict. Now, I thought you guys might find this interesting. So Dr. Seuss, who you may know from some of his famous children's books that you might have read when you were a kid, he also writes draws a lot of cartoons, political cartoons during World War II, and so these are some of his political cartoons about neutrality. And if you look here, it says in the USS Neutrality Act, it says all-out aid to our allies. So it should make you question again, how neutral is the United States really in the conflict? Okay? Because remember, when you're a neutral nation, you can engage in trading with other nations. Doesn't mean you have to remain totally out of the conflict. So we do engage in trading in a very specific way. So we're going to trade, again, most of our trade, if not all of our trade, is going to go to what becomes the Allied powers in World War II, which is France, Great Britain, and Russia. On the other side, the Axis powers is Japan, Germany, and Italy. So we're going to engage in trade, but it's almost entirely with the Allies. So there's two specific acts that are passed. One is called the cash and carry policy. So when we trade with the Allied powers, primarily Britain's going to benefit from a lot of these programs. What we do is something called cash and carry. So we're afraid of Britain and these other countries not having the ability to pay us if they buy these war materials, using credit. So what we do is we basically force them, they have to come to the United States, cash and carry, meaning they have to come pay in cash, and they have to transport it back home. Now, this kind of shows you, it takes out some of the risk of, being involved in war trading that got us into trouble in World War I, when we were trading, across the ocean and potentially our ships could be sunk. So the British have to come pick it up and then transport it back to their country. And then also paying in cash kind of limits the ability of them not to, pay us back if they buy it on credit. So that's the first concept that we have that's passed, called cash and carry. Now, Roosevelt is really putting a lot of pressure. He wants to, he feels like we need to help Britain, that we share so much in common with the British. We share a common origin, common history to a certain extent, that we share similar political systems, and that the fascists are just like a dangerous group of individuals in a dangerous society, and we need to kind of get involved. But the American public is still dead set against it. Even during the Battle of Britain and all these horrible things that we're learning about in the United States, they're still dead set against it. So Congress kind of takes it a step up without breaking our neutrality, and we're going to pass an act called the Lend-Lease Act of 1941. And the Lend-Lease Act, Britain basically, and a lot of these allied countries don't have the money to pay for cash and carry anymore. They don't have the cash to buy the war supplies, but they need the war supplies. So Congress gets creative. What they do is they pass the Lend-Lease Act, which means that the United States will lend these allied powers, tanks and bullets and guns, or let them lease these things from them, like rent them essentially. Now, it's kind of funny. Some congressmen are going to say, well, lending somebody a tank is the equivalent of lending somebody a piece of gum. After somebody chews that piece of gum, you're never going to want that back again. Like, we're lending these things to the battlefield. It's almost like, essentially, we're almost kind of giving it to them to a certain extent, because you're never going to get it back in the same quality that you lent it to them. So it should bring up the question of, is this breaking neutrality, the idea of the Lend-Lease Act, where you're lending military supplies to people? Can you do that and still be a neutral country? Can you lease them military supplies and still be a neutral country? So it kind of questions that whole idea of how neutral is the United States even prior to our entrance into the conflict. Okay, that kind of sets the European origins of the conflict and America's stance as far as neutrality is concerned. Our next screencast is going to focus much more on the Pacific. So we didn't get up to it. We didn't get up to the Pacific. So we'll focus on that in the next screencast, kind of what's going on in the Pacific theater, how the United States gets drawn in, why the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and then we'll kind of jump into what's going on in the home front in our last screencast for the spring break. All right, guys, so stay tuned for the next screencast. There'll be 2 more of them.